Uh, yeah, thanks, Sarah. So, Maury, why don't you introduce yourself and
Sure.
we'll start the session.
No, sounds good. Really great to have an opportunity to talk to everyone today about, the topics that we feel are certainly critical to the business. I am responsible for the sales motion at TNS for enterprises consuming these products. And in this overview, I genuinely think for enterprises out there, we're going to address this shifting threat as it's defined. And between Jim and I, hopefully, really position how TNS is a critical player in helping enterprises protect their businesses as it's certainly evolved. The threats evolved, and we're excited for the opportunity today to talk to you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Maury. And I'm the VP of Global Product Strategy. So I look after, one of the things I look after is expanding our ecosystem. We titled it Modernizing Voice, and as you kind of think about it, when you first got your first smartphone, what's really changed from that calling experience? Probably not a lot, but certainly within the application perspective, that's changed tremendously. So we'll talk a little bit about emerging fraud trends, how we're trying to modernize the voice channel in 2025, and we're doing that through what we call a zero trust call authentication and spoof protection. And as Sarah had mentioned, we'll look to either answer the questions at the end, or if appropriate, we'll answer the questions throughout the session. So I think a lot of people have seen this before. So what is caller ID spoofing? I put down the FCC's version of what the definition is. But if you've joined this call, I'm sure everybody knows what caller ID spoofing is. And there are legitimate reasons to spoof an enterprise number and use that as your call display for an outbound call. A doctor's office, for example, if they're calling from their mobile telephone number, their personal mobile telephone number, they want to give the telephone number for the office if you call back. Similarly, it may well be, if you're calling from a call center, you're going to want to put the customer care number on there. So there are definitely legitimate uses for caller ID spoofing. Unfortunately, the bad actors use those same techniques to try to defraud unwitting consumers. So when we look at protecting consumers, these numbers are kind of staggering. So data from the FTC shows that more than 10 billion in fraud has been committed in 2023, which is the first time that it's actually hit that particular number. If you talk to others like at AARP or what we saw at SIPNOC, that number is probably a fraction of the amount of fraud that actually happens within the industry, due to multiple factors. Some people don't even know that they've been scammed, and some people are too ashamed to report it with the FTC. So as you can see, reporting losing money from investment scams is the number one, is the highest category at 4.6 billion, about almost 50% of that. And then the second highest comes from imposter scams. And what's sad is that a study from Juniper Research finds that it'll exceed 76 billion globally next year. And these numbers kind of just roll off the tongue, if you will. We talk about billions, and I kind of almost think of the Austin Power movies where it's $1 billion, but that's a significant amount, and we kind of have become numb to how big these numbers are, and the impact that it can have. And it can certainly have an impact on the enterprise brand, which is just as important. And I'll turn it over to Maury and let him speak to this a little bit.
I think that what we have to all come to grips with is that the threat has shifted. There's been an incredible focus for the past 10 years plus in safeguarding the local area network and the wide area network. As you guys know, the threats there are still ongoing, but the energy put toward protecting those environments has been the primary focus of executive leaders. It's for obvious reasons. Could you imagine, and you've seen the damage done through ransomwares and malwares and different attacks into local area networks that allowed bad actors to gain access to information and then exploit those companies. There have been safeguards that have been the focus through protective appliances, firewalls, if you will, and different behavioral analytics that could protect that network. But in recognition of all the defenses being applied at those ingress locations coming in from data networks into private networks, what do you think happened? Whack-a-mole is now in full play. The actual threat, the bad actors, if you will, have found a new place to attack the consumer. And it's maybe not directly attacking the enterprise, but what's very important to recognize here is, isn't the brand still compromised if consumers of that enterprise product are now getting exploited? And that's effectively what's happening. I mean, a financial institution has significant exposure in the event that their network has become protected. You can no longer just attack that network of a financial institution in a singular fashion. But what if you distribute your attack and turn your focus to the consumer? That financial institution absolutely owns the responsibility to protect its local area and wide area network exposure. But now with this departure from the branches of doing business locally or on site to now being able to use your mobile device, the threat, as we all know, shifted to the actual devices within the consumer's possession. And in recognition of that, the bad actors, what do? As we all know, they start calling and they impersonate. They use omni-channel tactics of messaging in advance of maybe calling to supplement their attack story and in a way solicit that user, that consumer, to, at the end of the day, send them money. And in the event that it happens, it doesn't happen, of the percentages that are exorbitant, but it just takes one, and that person becomes exploited, and the messaging throughout the business and consumer networks are that, hey, this institution didn't protect me. And I think that any executive overseeing a financial institution has risk and brand as two of their top considerations to protect that enterprise, that business. And when your consumers are being attacked to the extent that we are witnessing, it has to be the new focus from a fraud mitigation standpoint. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more in another slide about why it's different. Why did all of a sudden this become an issue at the level that the impersonation can be as effective as it is? And Jim and I'll kind of recognize the problem is evident, the phishing is extensive, and when attacked, a bank or financial institution faces extensive exposure in the media and other channels that dilute the brand. So for the most part, we want to underscore that there are techniques, there are technologies that are out there to safeguard that consumer and that brand, and they're not unrealistically deployed. So Jim, if you want to go to the next one here, we can kind of go down this path. The consumer does not at all times take full responsibility for an attack. We're fully aware that they will look to their organizations they do business with to protect them. It's just the nature of our culture. Maybe we should be more aware. Maybe we should be more cognizant that these unrealistic situations occur. But when you're elderly, or when you're even at all generations now, they're fully subjected to situational attacks that are actually very well crafted. We know that through that, the institutions need to take that accountability because they don't want their brand diluted. And we want to recognize that the executives themselves have to consider trust as a strategic agenda that is just as critical as risk and brand. So when you have a strategic goal for an enterprise, it's got to include all aspects of where the threat has shifted. And I think everyone on the call may play a role at some level of protecting their entities or participating in threat detection or mitigation at different levels of wherever it might occur. TNS is here to deliver a solution that addresses that, if you will, call path or signaling path and ensure that anybody that circumvents it does not make it to the end consumer with an actual message or a phone call. Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Maurie. And as you can see, the consumers here, really believe that it's the enterprise that should, help protect them, and it really, is important about, gaining trust. I think everyone has seen, the impetus of branded calling, and how that can modernize the voice channel by delivering, a logo, by delivering call intent, and the branded name. And that's great, but the challenge becomes, so how do I know that it's actually, that enterprise that's calling me, or that bank, or that that healthcare institution, or or the doctor's office, for example. And so we'll talk about two concepts: enterprise authentication and spoof protection, that actually need to happen before you can start delivering any of that rich content. And with authentication, and we'll get into it in a slide a little bit further along, where Maury will describe it a little bit in more detail, is that we really need to validate and register the legitimacy of the business to confirm that they have the right to use those telephone numbers, um, which is, part of the vetting process, and that we want to be able to then block calls that are not coming from that particular enterprise before they reach the consumer. The worst thing that you can do is, have a telephone number that a consumer has put in their, contact or their address book. When they see the number pop up, and they have that, in their address book, they're going to be able to say, okay, then I know that that's, from that particular enterprise or that institution. But they don't know whether the number is being spoofed or not. So blocking that call in the network without reaching the consumer is important. And then it's also, important that, in where Maury was going before, was to understand, when these attacks are coming. I think it's a little, Maury talked a little bit about it from a WAN LAN perspective. Much easier to understand when a DDoS attack is happening. But certainly, if you're not making the calls and they're coming from a bad actor, there's no way to know that something's occurring, with your brand in the network, unless you have that type of reporting. And so what does that do? It allows you to kind of know that, okay, these calls could be potentially coming in. Maury talked about, it being, multimodal, and phishing attacks are going to happen, with, via, the text channel or email, or through other means. So having your contact center agents, aware that something's occurring, is important, so that they may institute, during that period of time where there's an attack, that they're a little bit more, conscious of what's going on, and ensuring that, if they're willing, if they're ready to take, money out of a financial institution, that, maybe ask a couple more questions, and you route that call a little bit differently. We've talked a little bit about, branded calling with logo, but again, you don't want to be able to add that rich content to the call screen, with the name, logo, which we were able to do today across the three major networks. But again, you're going to have a secure and end-to-end authentication framework to make sure that they're not spoofed. that the consumer can then trust the voice channel, and as we're continuing to modernize it. And again, we'll put fraud protection, front and center in 2025. So let me turn it back to Maurie to talk about what we mean by the zero trust call authentication and what we're doing with spoof protection.
All right, thanks, Jim. And certainly the slide you're about to see is not intended to make your heads explode, but there is some technical diagramming as Jim shifts to it. So it's just a table stakes here, guys, for you to kind of stare at as I hopefully take you down a path that the technology has shifted toward so that TNS can act on your behalf to protect you when calls are made by imposters. That's really what it comes down to. We want your customers answering calls made by you, not by somebody else. And the high level architecture that satisfies that requirement is that we connect to where you make the call or it's originated. You may use a cloud-based contact center solution, and we totally recognize that and just need to know that maybe you have a Genesis cloud solution or maybe you use NICE and Contact. If those calls are made from a specific platform and we have a relationship to that platform, simply an API connection, let's say, that allows us to know that the call was launched. And when the call is eventually terminated to the wireless endpoint where the threats are evident, we can actually let that wireless provider know that, hey, there's a call that has been launched and is headed to them. And in matching, what are two tokens from the originating side and a token that would be matched with the terminating end, we can authenticate. So this is a model that for spoof protection and even for logo allows authentication to protect the end-to-end call. Now, if somebody launched a call from a origination point that we didn't have a connection to, and I wouldn't want one with an imposter, what's the problem going to be? Well, he didn't send me a token. He didn't send me half of the equation to get the call terminated. So when I basically receive a call or a notification comes from, how about this? A notification comes from the wireless provider saying, I see this coming in, and I go to match with a token that I never had the originating side. We don't allow that call to be processed. We basically tell them to tear it down. So the high level concept here is wherever your calls are launched, I want to connect to. If you still use a platform PBX for your outbound that could be Avaya or whatever platform, if I have a connection to it, I can protect you. And that's the model that I think is critical. It's a critical evolution from where we've come from, because in the traditional SIP and TDM worlds, there was never a matching of, say, a token out of band that said, hey, we recognize both ends, we're good to go. And like Jim said, you don't know this is happening because imposters circumvent the originating side and become you, effectively kind of cloning the originating side. And when that happens, the exposure can be much greater than you even have become aware. And that's a threat to a business that isn't the traditional DDoS attack or ransomware attack that you could almost evaluate once you found it because you saw that traffic hitting the front end of your network. Well, what happens if it's distributed across the millions of customers you have potentially? And in doing so, it's almost like it runs rampant and you can't stop it. And it becomes very concerning that exposure becomes as great as it would to your consumers. If we can control, if we can see the calls made by your agents going to your customers, that effectively allows only the good calls to go through. And then ultimately, the calls that aren't originated by your business, by your enterprise, they are not processed. So this ability for us to kind of see both sides, and that's the full goal, allows us to protect the businesses, and in turn, the traffic that does terminate restores trust to your customers. And again, that's what we're trying to get back to. If they see a call and potentially a brand on that call, that alerts to them, hey, this is it alerts them an authenticated call. They may not know the inner workings of it, but when you were able to do that, and the customer always remembers that every time they pick up that call, they're who they say they are, well, then they trust your brand. They look at it and go, yeah, every time I see this, it's the same person that I wanted to talk to, or effectively, I know who's calling me. Answer rates increase, trust is increased. So these products will restore trust. They just have to be utilized. Otherwise, enterprises and brands, financial institutions, they're at full exposure. There's not really an option. It's almost like not using a firewall just because you want to kind of play the odds. Well, the odds are you're going to have an issue. And it becomes that way when major financial institutions start to put the defenses up. What do you think happens to the second level financial institutions? That's where the threat's going to resonate. So we need to know that even downstream to the smaller banks, that measures are being taken to spoof protect. And in doing so, the threat will move. We just have to get ahead of it. And I think everyone on the call needs to recognize the technologies we offer are almost table stakes. And that's really what we want to be here to discuss with you, to deploy in the best realistic solution for your company, because everybody wants to get back to 1995 when they were actually excited that their cell phone rang. So, Jim, we need to actually go back in time, which is ironic, but we need to use some technology from today to get back to that level of trust.
Yeah, so we have to go back to the future, if
Right.
you will.
We're going to kind of go back and, enjoy that same experience, but use technology from today to execute on it.
Yeah, and the point that you're making here is this connectivity is between us and the enterprise or the calling platform, where we've seen, for example, like where Stir Shaken, there are issues with Stir Shaken. A couple of them are that the RCD information isn't always carried forward because, as you mentioned, TDM is in the middle somewhere. In addition, we've seen over attestation. If you look at one of our robocall investigation reports, you'll see just with invalid numbers, we see 10% of those calls have A-level attestation, and so just relying on Stir Shaken alone isn't the right answer. So the way we know this, again, we're going to have to go to an out-of-band approach where we have a direct connection with the enterprise. And oh, by the way, we've updated the data from where you saw in Washington. I added a few more customers. We have insurance companies in here. We have a couple of banks in here. We also have a lawyer in here, and these numbers are staggering when you start looking at in October alone. Again, customer number 4, financial institution, had lower number of spoofed calls. I think it's probably pretty well known that Maurie indicated that this institution's going to start blocking calls, and they're not going to now get their number spoofed. It's going to move on to the bad actors are smart, and they're going to move on to other customers. But when you look at these enterprises, numbers range anywhere from mid-teens to up to 30%. So this is actually really, really staggering when you look at how often customers' numbers are being spoofed. I would have thought that it would have been more in the 5 to 10% range, but again, this is really important data that the enterprise is unaware of, that it can be up to 25% of the time my number is being displayed to an end, or trying to be displayed to an end user, actually isn't from me. And and as you start to, is Maurie indicated, when I start delivering the logo and I start getting more trust that this is the brand, I'm much more willing to engage, and the conversations get longer, the outcomes become better. Interestingly enough, with some financial institutions. We've seen this concept of, well, the answer rate actually didn't go up, but what we saw was something called ghost payments. So, Maurie may have received a call from, a certain financial bank or financial institution, a bank, or, a credit card company. Oops, I forgot, I see that they called. I forgot to actually make my payment. And rather than, necessarily needing to re-engage with, the contact center agent on an inbound call, Maury will just pay the bill. And so we've seen an increase, in what we call ghost payments. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that, your calls are going to be longer, or, that your calls are going to be longer, that you're going to have more calls answered, but the outcomes actually really improve when you start using branded calling, especially when you implement, this authentication and spoof protection. So, um, you know, I think good news, I think it's a win-win-win situation when we employ authentication, spoof protection, displaying the brand name and displaying, a logo, and eventually with call intent. So that kind of takes us to the end of the presentation. We wanted to, try to keep it to a brief 30 minutes. I don't see any questions in the chat. Sarah, if you want to open it up to questions on the call, Maury and I can certainly do that.